John Pike here with some cover crop observations from the spring and summer of 2023. Noticed a lot of discussions on Facebook and other social media platforms about the challenges and some of the observations that others are having with cover crops this year. And I thought it was a good idea to maybe talk about some of the things that I'm seeing on my farm, where I have cover crop and no cover crop strip trial comparisons that have been in underway for a couple of years now. And I think that one thing that needs to be taken in consideration is the seasonal variations and cover crop management that goes along with that to get the best outcomes that we can. There's many people that are relatively new adopters to cover crops, and with that limited amount of experience and knowing that we don't have the weather extremes that we've seen this year come along on a regular basis, thankfully, we can maybe learn from that on what to be looking for ahead of time so we can better manage cover crops ahead of time. I've got a established cover crop, no cover crop strip trial on my farm that's part of the SARE project with University of Illinois, and we're using this as well for some nematode testing for a project with Illinois Soybean Association, and go through a couple of pictures here of some of the things that we're seeing. In this trial, I had 60-foot alternating strips of soybeans that were drilled on the same day, same variety and everything, into strips that had not had a cover crop planted on them, and comparing that to cover crop strips where we planted into fairly late termination. So the rye was about at anthesis stage, which would crimp down very well and provide some weed suppression and better moisture conservation through the course of the year. But this year we saw a little bit different response than we had in the past, where the drilled soybeans without the cover crop, they came up very well right off the bat, and we can see the picture there of the strip. We've got a good stand. Emergence was very uniform and just what we'd be looking for in any drilled soybean environment, especially in this no-till field. If we move forward and we make an observation of the cereal rye cover crop strips, we can see that is not as pleasing result there. We had intermittent, delayed emergence in some cases, and the only thing different was that with this was just the fact that the cover crop was there versus no cover crop. But I think that it's important to understand or make an observation about why the response was so drastic this year with the cover crop, because this isn't something that has been observed in this trial over the last 4 years. Before, the emergence has been fairly uniform, and the development of the soybeans through the crop year has been relatively consistent. But what we saw this year, not just with the dry conditions that we had across southern Illinois early in the year, but our drought and dry spell had stretched to late last summer. So we were going into this not just with the impact of the dry planting conditions at this time, but we were also going into this with an extended period that caused a lot of differences from the normal year that we would normally look at. So in a lot of cases, what I've experienced with farmers and others that are making observations that, well, the cover crop was at a disadvantage this year, so it was because of the cover crop. And I think that we need to look at the fact that there's differences in the way to manage this cover crop. And we've talked before about using the cover crop by delaying termination to help dry out soils in a wet spring, and this shows that the cover crop was very effective in doing this. But with the extension of the dry period, it had a very severe negative impact on the development of the stand. So we think that might be just the fact that we have the cover crop here. But if we move on to the next slide, we see it within the same field, same planting conditions and everything. I terminated the same cover crop that was planted into at late termination on the previous slide, and no-tilled soybeans into the cover crop part of the field, but had been terminated earlier. So this part of the field was terminated in early April, when the rye was probably 6 to 8 inches tall, the early vegetative stage. So by doing that, the cover crop didn't take as much moisture out of the ground, so we were planting into a better condition for this particular year. So the difference here isn't cover crop versus no cover crop, it's cover crop versus how the cover crop was managed. And in this spring, in a lot of places, there was a definite advantage to early termination of the cover crop. So if we look and also make some observation within the crop residue, we can see quite a difference in the way that the corn residue has broken down since last year in the cover crop versus where there wasn't any cover crop. So if we look at the corn residue within the beans that are emerging, we can see that there's a lot of cobs and a lot of stalks left that are the slower part to break down, but we had good biological activity with that cover crop in there to help break down a lot of the fragile part of the corn leaves and others. And if we move forward into one slide here, this shows the residue 60 feet away and how it didn't break down so much without the cover crop. So we need to do a good job of assessing why we're seeing the cover crop response or non-response in sometimes. And I think in this year, it's very important to do that because of the challenges that we've seen in many cases with later terminated cover crops. And we were creating a disadvantage in many cases by allowing that cover crop to grow, take moisture out of the ground. So we were planting into dry. And where this year was different than a lot, normally we'll get a rain every 5 to 7 days in the spring to kind of replenish that and help new stand establishment take place. We didn't have any rain on this field from the time it was planted for about 3 weeks. And in that time, it was dry when we planted, and it was drier as we moved forward. So we were just setting ourselves up with that later termination this year to be at a disadvantage. So we need to keep those things in mind as we move forward. A lot of benefits to be realized with cover crops, but not every year is a year to manage the same. So we need to be looking forward and back at the weather forecasts and the conditions that have been present on our farm, so we can do the best job of managing that cover crop for the crop moving forward into the year. So with that, we'll look at follow this through the year and look at other slides later on and see what we end up with at the end of the season.